Summer 1943. When the North African campaign ended and German forces surrendered in Tunisia, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers were taken prisoner. Long convoys of trucks crawled across the desert, engines humming through the dust. None of the men knew that their final destination was not Europe, but across the ocean. America. They were loaded onto naval transports, blindfolded for hours, and when the light finally returned, they found themselves in a world none had imagined. Endless cornfields, white-painted wooden houses, and skies untouched by war. America received them not with gunfire, but with the cold orderliness of a system ready to hold hundreds of thousands of enemies without losing its humanity. Between 1943 and 1945, over 370,000 German POWs were brought to more than 600 camps across the United States. From the arid lands of Arizona to the green forests of Minnesota, from the plains of Texas to towns in Pennsylvania and Kentucky. Some camps were little more than barbed wire enclosures, while others, like Camp Crossville in Tennessee or Camp Clinton in Mississippi, resembled small towns complete with housing, dining halls, libraries, ball fields, and even orchestras. To the Germans, these places were both prisons and another world, peaceful, distant, almost unreal. When the trains stopped at small-town stations, locals gathered to watch, half curious, half wary. To Americans, these were the enemies who had ravaged Europe. To the Germans, it was their first glimpse of American farmers, women in simple dresses and children waving small flags. No one threw stones. No one cursed. They simply looked. And in that gaze was curiosity, not hatred. Many prisoners were struck silent. As they were driven to camp in army trucks, the only sound was that of tires rolling on asphalt, something many had never seen back home. Inside the camps, the world was nothing like Nazi propaganda had promised. They had been told Americans were brutal and chaotic. Yet here they were, issued blankets and mattresses, fed meat, vegetables, and hot coffee, and greeted each morning with a polite, "Good morning, prisoner," from U.S. guards. One elderly sergeant later wrote, "I thought I'd be beaten or starved. Instead, they gave me soap, a towel, and told me I could read in the library." Prisoners were organized by rank, officers separated, enlisted men assigned to labor. They worked on farms, in workshops, or on road maintenance. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, they were paid in coupons used to buy cigarettes, soap, or stationery at the camp store. Some states even allowed local farmers to hire POWs for harvest season under military supervision, paying them the same as American workers minus food and lodging costs. Many Southern farmers, short of labor, remarked, "Those Germans worked so hard and disciplined, you'd hardly believe they were prisoners." Within the barracks, the men built their own social life. They formed reading clubs, orchestras, theater troupes, even handwritten German newspapers. At Crossville, a choir performed Bach and Beethoven for Christmas. At Camp Clinton, German officers organized classes in math, mechanics, and philosophy, later formally recognized as the College of Clinton. Many young soldiers who had only known rifles and orders learned trades, mechanics, or English during their internment. What astonished them most was the fairness. U.S. guards were trained never to humiliate or strike prisoners, even those who had lost loved ones in Europe. "Don't lose the difference between us and them," one American officer said during training, and that rule held firm. Complaints could be sent through the Red Cross. Sick prisoners were treated in clinics staffed by both American and German doctors. Still, not everything was peaceful. Some camps, especially in the South, were touched by local prejudice, and ideological rifts persisted among the prisoners. Hardline Nazi officers formed secret cells to punish those seen as traitors or too friendly with Americans. Some men were beaten or even killed. The U.S. Army intervened, isolating extremists. Yet across the system, violence and death rates remained remarkably low, far lower than in European or Asian camps. As the war turned, new groups of prisoners arrived, young, weary, disillusioned with the thousand-year Reich. On quiet summer nights, the sound of mandolins or harmonicas floated across the camp fences, sometimes joined by soft laughter. A few American guards sat outside listening. In those moments, the line between captor and captive blurred, just people far from home waiting for a new world. There were women too, a small number of female German POWs, mostly Luftwaffe clerks or nurses, held in auxiliary camps. They were treated gently, assigned to office or hospital work. For them, America was a double shock. Not only defeat, but the sight of American women driving cars, working as engineers, supervising factory lines, roles considered unfeminine in Nazi Germany. Many later wrote that only in captivity did they realize America's strength came not just from weapons, but from a society where women, workers, and immigrants all stood together for a shared purpose. By early 1945, as the war neared its end, many camps had become unlikely centers of cultural exchange. Prisoners gave concerts for locals, crafted souvenirs to send home, even helped rebuild barns or harvest crops. In small towns, families invited POWs for dinner. "They're not enemies anymore, just young men who lost their way," one American woman wrote to her husband at the front. Those quiet gestures transformed many hearts. When asked what impressed them most POWs answered the same. They treated us like human beings. That spring, news of Berlin's fall reached the camps. There was no cheering, only silence. Some men wept, others wrote farewell letters to families they weren't sure had survived. A strange calm filled the barracks, relief mixed with emptiness. As white flags rose over Europe, the men across the ocean understood their war was truly over. They were prepared for repatriation. Before leaving, many wrote thank you letters to their American officers or carved German words into wooden walls. Here we learned respect. What they took home was more than memory. It was a new understanding of the world, that an enemy could be decent, that war cannot extinguish humanity. In the years that followed, many former POWs became teachers, engineers, businessmen, helping rebuild Germany. Some wrote memoirs calling their time in America a school of humanity. In their memories, America was no longer the mighty foe, but a mirror of order, discipline, and compassion. And in the vast history of World War II, amid so many blood-stained pages, the story of the German POW camps in the United States remains a rare proof of something simple yet profound. Even in the darkest war, humanity can keep its light. For most German prisoners, the voyage across the Atlantic was more than a journey halfway around the world. It was a passage through illusion. From the locked decks of the transport ships, they heard the waves pounding against steel hulls and wondered, how would the Americans treat men who had once fired at them? In Germany, Goebbels' propaganda machine had long etched a caricature into their minds, the Americans as a mongrel, materialistic people, greedy, chaotic, uncultured, a nation of jazz dancers and canned meat eaters. Many believed that capture meant torture or death. So when they finally set foot on American soil, they carried a cold, tightening fear. The fear of those convinced they were about to pay for all the sins of war. Yet the America that unfolded before their eyes was nothing like the propaganda. From the train windows, the prisoners saw endless green fields, neat wooden houses, and mild-faced farmers waving and greeting. In small towns, children ran alongside the trains shouting, "The Germans are coming!" Half afraid, half curious. No one threw stones, no one spat insults. For the Germans, that alone was disorienting. How could a country at war remain so peaceful? How could the enemy greet them without hatred? The feeling only deepened when they entered the camps. At Camp Crossville, the barracks stood in clean rows under tin roofs, the yard swept spotless. American guards greeted them calmly. "Welcome to Crossville, gentlemen." The word gentleman stunned many. Gentlemen? For defeated men wearing the insignia of an enemy army? One old German officer later recalled, "I expected humiliation, but they only asked my name and told me to wash up and have dinner." That first meal was another shock. Beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, coffee, and pudding. Some prisoners refused to eat, suspecting a trick, until they saw the guards eating the same food. When they realized this was the standard ration, they exchanged bitter smiles. At the front, they had survived on moldy bread and watery soup. Here, in the enemy's prison, they ate well and clean. "For the first time in my life," one soldier wrote in his diary, "I could fill my stomach without killing anyone." The early days in camp brought one surprise after another. Hot showers, beds with mattresses and blankets, a medical ward with real doctors and medicine. They were issued clean clothes, razors, and soap. Many had never used a toothbrush before. A young sergeant who had fought at Stalingrad stood silently before a running tap, watching the water flow, a sight he hadn't seen in 2 years. "In Europe, we froze and starved," he murmured. "Here they tell us to wash." The greater shock came when they saw how Americans worked. In supply sections, American women wore coveralls, drove trucks, managed kitchens, and supervised warehouses. For prisoners raised in a militarized culture where women were confined to home and obedience, it was a reversal of everything they knew. A German telegraph operator wrote home, "Here, women speak to men as equals. They give orders, they laugh, and no one despises them." For many prisoners, that realization, that the world they had been taught to scorn was not weak at all, was more unsettling than defeat itself. In camp, they soon learned America's unbreakable rule: the law is the law. No matter who you were, Nazi, farmer, or officer, you had the right to eat, to receive medical care, to send letters. Some demanded special treatment as honor prisoners, but the guards simply replied, "Here, everyone is equal." A simple answer, but to Germans raised on hierarchy and dominance, it struck at the core of their worldview. By day, they worked. Some were sent to farms to pick cotton or corn, or to mend fences. Others worked in carpentry shops, mechanical repair, or drafting rooms. Every hour was paid in coupons redeemable for cigarettes, chocolate, or postage stamps. Many camps had movie screenings, libraries, and ball fields. The U.S. Army saw imprisonment not as punishment, but as a way to maintain humane order. "They wanted us to learn something," one POW said, and they succeeded. But the real shock of civilization wasn't material, it was moral. When they saw American soldiers speak to officers calmly and without fear, they realized that power here did not depend on terror. When they saw a black soldier assigned as a supervisor, they were even more bewildered. Such a thing was unthinkable in Germany. And when they heard Roosevelt's speeches on the radio about freedom from fear and freedom from want, many began to sense that the America they had hated might not be the kingdom of chaos Goebbels had described, but a society built on laws and faith in human dignity. Of course, not everyone changed. Within the camps, die-hard Nazis still held secret meetings, hung flags, and threatened those who grew too friendly with the Americans. Clashes broke out, some men were even killed. The U.S. Army tightened discipline and began classifying prisoners by ideology. The moderates were sent to re-education camps, where they watched documentaries, attended lectures on American history, and read literature. The goal was not to indoctrinate, but to let them compare and judge for themselves. When asked what he thought, one German officer said, "We came here to be imprisoned, but we were taught about freedom." In December 1944, as news of the Battle of the Bulge reached the camps, hope flickered again among the prisoners, a desperate belief in a final miracle. But by spring 1945, hope was gone. Word spread: Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered. The prisoners sat silently in the yards, watching the American flag ripple against a blue sky. Some pounded tables and wept. Others smiled faintly in relief. "The war is over," a young soldier whispered, "and maybe at last we are allowed to be human." Even after the war ended, the U.S. government did not rush to release them. They stayed for months, helping with harvests, repairs, and construction. Many wrote home to say they no longer feared Americans. In fact, they admired their composure and mercy. Some were invited to dinner by farm families, posed for photographs, and kept those pictures for the rest of their lives. To them, America was no longer a capitalist enemy, but a strange land where humanity was practiced even in victory. Years later, back in Germany, they still remembered that first shock, the moment they realized Americans were nothing like what they had believed. Some told their grandchildren, "There, I learned that dignity is not in victory or defeat, but in how people treat one another." Others wrote memoirs, sending belated thanks across the ocean. One former POW wrote simply, "We came as enemies and left as students." That is the irony of history. Sometimes the greatest lessons are not taught by victory, but by how a nation treats the defeated. To those prisoners, America was not merely a military power, but a civilization so confident it no longer needed to prove itself through violence. And thus, that shock of civilization, from fear to doubt to admiration, became one of World War II's quietest, yet most enduring legacies. When the guns in Europe had not yet fallen silent, the prisoner of war camps on American soil remained tranquil, like a parallel world where enemies were confined but not humiliated, where war seemed only a distant echo on the radio. For the Germans, the most bewildering thing was not defeat itself, but the way Americans behaved after victory. Here, discipline and humanity coexisted, a combination they had never seen in their own army. From the start, the U.S. War Department issued a clear directive. Prisoners are human beings, not instruments of revenge. That sentence became the guiding principle for an entire system managing more than 300,000 men from across the ocean. Every American officer in charge of a camp was trained in the 1929 Geneva Convention that prisoners must receive adequate food, medical care, male privileges, and freedom from forced labor. At a time when much of the world treated captives with contempt, America's policy stood out as rare, even contrary to the human instinct for vengeance after such devastating loss. Each camp operated under a dual system. The U.S. Army maintained security and oversight, while prisoners were allowed to elect internal committees to handle daily affairs, from ration distribution to labor organization and recreation. The Americans understood that the best way to maintain order was to let prisoners manage themselves within boundaries. That trust paid off. Most camps ran with strict discipline and almost no riots. One American officer wrote in his report, "We don't need to beat them to make them obey, just to show them that the rules here are fair." Rations for German POWs matched those of non-combat U.S. soldiers: meat, white bread, vegetables, and sometimes fruit or dessert. For men from bombed-out Germany, where people fought over a slice of black bread, such meals felt unreal. A German officer wrote to his wife, "I eat better here than I ever did in Berlin." Many felt shame and guilt knowing their families at home were starving. Work in the camps was organized with the same humane spirit. Prisoners could refuse any labor directly related to the war, but most volunteered, to earn small wages and regain a sense of usefulness. They joined crews cutting timber, farming, repairing tools, cleaning, or working in mechanical shops. They were paid in scrip redeemable at the camp store, a modest shop selling everything from razors to postcards, candy to books. One American guard joked, "They live like they're in a resort with barbed wire." Of course, that was only half true. Beneath the surface lay homesickness, loss, and uncertainty. Yet the rhythm of work and order allowed them to feel human again. Evenings in the camps were strangely peaceful. After labor hours, prisoners could move freely within the compound. They formed music clubs, soccer teams, theater troupes, and reading circles. Many camps had libraries managed by the prisoners themselves, stocked with thousands of German and English books donated by the Red Cross. Educated officers organized classes in philosophy, mathematics, engineering, and classical literature. At Camp Clinton, these classes became so advanced that Americans nicknamed it the University Behind Barbed Wire. Some studied to pass time, others to forget the war, and some because they had realized that knowledge was the only way out of the darkness created by fanaticism. Beyond academics, they were introduced to democratic education, a program designed by the U.S. Office of War Information to plant the seeds of liberty in the minds of those once devoted to racial supremacy. It began cautiously. American soldiers screened documentaries about the U.S. Constitution, individual freedoms, elections, and the rule of law. No sermons, no coercion, just comparison. After the war, the program expanded to include open debates and discussion forums. Former German officers, once used to commanding others, now had to listen and argue as equals. Some dismissed it as the victor's nonsense, but gradually they were persuaded, not by force, but by the quiet patience of their captors. One March evening in 1945, at a Texas camp, the Americans screened Why We Fight, Frank Capra's famous documentary explaining why the U.S. had entered the war. When the lights came back on, silence filled the room. A prisoner finally rose and said hoarsely, "If we had seen films like this in Germany, perhaps we would never have gone to war." That line spread through the camp like a sigh of an age, a late but sincere confession. American officers were often astonished by the Germans' discipline. They rose early, stood in line, cleaned their quarters, and saluted with precision. Some camps even allowed them to keep the German flag, minus the Nazi symbol, so they could retain a sense of honor. That respect fostered cooperation and eased hostility. The Americans understood a crucial truth. To teach democracy, one must first show respect. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were occasional escapes, extremist assaults, or food protests. But overall, the U.S. POW system stood as a rare model of wartime humanity. The International Red Cross inspected frequently and praised the living standards. A 1944 report concluded, "The United States is the only nation treating the custody of prisoners as a moral duty rather than an act of punishment." In the war's final days, as the horrors of Nazi concentration camps were exposed, many German POWs were overcome with shock and shame. They could not believe such crimes had been committed in their country's name. The Americans did not scold them. They simply showed the films and left them alone to face the truth. That silence, more than any accusation, broke many hearts. A German officer later wrote, "No one forced us to our knees, but they made us bow our heads." When repatriation began, many prisoners felt torn. They longed for home, yet feared it, the ruins, the hunger, and the guilt they now carried. Some volunteered to stay longer, working for the U.S. Army as builders, cleaners, or translators. They said that within those barbed wire fences, they had learned what it meant to be free, a freedom born not from flags or orders, but from mutual respect. Years later, as Germany rose from its ashes, those former POWs brought back their most precious possession, the memory of a democracy without hatred. They became teachers, engineers, journalists, civil servants, the builders of a new Germany. Some kept writing to the American families who had treated them kindly. Others named their sons Franklin or Harry, in honor of Roosevelt and Truman, the presidents of the nation that had taught them their greatest lesson. The story of the German POWs in America is not merely one of wartime mercy. It is proof that the true strength of a civilization lies not in weapons, but in forgiveness and education. When men who were once enemies can learn the meaning of freedom inside a prison, that victory belongs not just to an army, but to humanity itself. And in the memories of the hundreds of thousands of Germans who once set foot on American soil, what they carried to their graves was not the shame of defeat, but the faith that dignity can be restored even amid the ashes of war. When the white flag fluttered over the Reichstag and Berlin lay in ashes, the barbed wire fences across America still stood silent, like a thin boundary between past and future. News of Germany's surrender reached the prisoners through Army radio. The American announcer's firm voice, then sudden silence, leaving the air heavy with something unspoken. Many refused to believe it. Some sank to the ground, burying their heads in their hands. Others stood motionless, staring into the distance as if trying to see through half the world to glimpse their collapsing homeland. For months, camp life continued as usual. Meals on schedule, shifts on time, lights out at 9. Yet something inside had changed. The arrogance of the Nazi warrior was gone, replaced by emptiness and uncertainty. They were no longer prisoners of Germany, yet not free citizens either. Souls caught between two worlds, between the memory of war and the unformed reality of peace. The American officers sensed this. They stopped calling them enemy soldiers and began using new words: disarmed personnel. The term sounded softer, more humane, as if marking a quiet passage from war to peace. But for the Germans, it did little to ease the void. Letters arrived from home, torn envelopes, trembling handwriting describing ruined cities, barren fields, missing relatives. One note contained only a few words: "We are alive. Come home if you can." The camps, once prisons, now felt like shelters of a strange kind. Outside, Germany lay in ruins, but within the fences they still had beds, food, doctors, and a sense of order. Many feared leaving. Where can we go when there is no home? That question echoed through evening conversations. Young American guards, soon to be discharged themselves, felt an odd attachment to these polite prisoners. Some shared cigarettes, others taught English, and some exchanged letters, fragile bonds forming between men who had once aimed rifles at each other. When repatriation began in late 1945, the camps buzzed with emotion. Every morning, loudspeakers read lists of names, those leaving first, those later. Some cheered, some wept, some stood silent, unsure what to feel. In reality, going home was not simple. Many were first sent to Britain or France to work on reconstruction farms before being allowed to return to Germany. Senior officers were held for war crime investigations. The rest, the ordinary soldiers, waited months, even years. In that limbo, they belonged nowhere. One autumn morning in 1945 at Camp Swift, Texas, the Americans assembled all prisoners and announced, "You are no longer prisoners of war. From now on, you will be considered civilian laborers." The words stunned many. Being a prisoner, though shameful, still carried identity. Civilian laborer? Was that freedom or another kind of exile? They were sent to work outside the camp, harvesting cotton, cutting timber, building roads, only to return at night behind the same fences. Freedom stood just beyond the gate, yet no one dared to cross. Around the same time, large camps like Fort Robinson, Camp McCoy, and Camp Clinton organized new activities. Film screenings, concerts, lectures, even art exhibitions created by the prisoners themselves. Men who once drew battle maps now painted Texas landscapes. Hands that once held rifles now held brushes, painting skies of an unfamiliar blue. An American officer remarked, "When the enemy begins to paint flowers, the war is truly over." One remarkable development was the rise of the so-called friendship projects. Across the Midwest, American farming communities began interacting with German prisoners working nearby. They chatted, shared food, even invited them to Christmas dinners. These small gestures slowly erased the line between victor and defeated. Some families even petitioned for certain prisoners to stay after repatriation, offering them jobs as laborers or household helpers. The army usually declined, but occasionally made exceptions for those with good relations with local citizens. In many camps, the final nights before departure were the most memorable. Prisoners gathered around campfires singing old German folk songs, not marches, but soft, mournful tunes. American guards stood at a distance, listening in silence, then applauding. A German wrote in his diary, "Between us there is no hatred anymore, only the sorrow of survivors." When the repatriation convoys finally departed, the scenes moved even the guards. The men who once wore gray uniforms now dressed in work clothes, carrying small mementos, a photo, a notebook, a harmonica, as they boarded trucks. Some turned and waved, others bowed their heads, unable to look back. One American officer wrote, "We saw them off like friends bound for a place they themselves no longer knew." Ships carrying the prisoners home passed by the Statue of Liberty. Many stood silently on deck, watching her gleam in the sunlight, feeling as though they were parting from something sacred they had only begun to understand. One man whispered, "If Germany had known this kind of light, perhaps we would never have lost our way." A U.S. journalist later cited that line as a symbol of post-war awakening. When they set foot again in Europe, they were no longer conquerors. Many said that their time in American camps had taught them something they had never known, that real strength lies not in weapons, but in respect for others. They returned to a shattered homeland, yet became among the first to rebuild it, with their hands and with a new faith. It is hard to say who truly won that war. The Americans triumphed militarily, but also morally. The Germans were defeated, yet in that defeat they rediscovered their humanity. They went home carrying memories of an America both firm and compassionate, a memory that would take root in the democratic soil of the new Germany. Decades later, reunions took place. In 1963, a group of former German POWs returned to the United States to visit their old camp in Arkansas. Where barbed wire once stood, there were now green fields. Only faint foundations and a few concrete posts remained. They walked in silence, touched the weathered stones, and said to one another, "We learned to be human here." An elderly former American guard stepped forward, shaking hands with each man. No prisoners, no guards, only people who had once shared a painful yet humane chapter of history. Between two worlds, between war and peace, defeat and rebirth, the German prisoners on American soil became an invisible bridge between two civilizations once at odds. They carried not only memories, but a conviction that humanity can survive even the worst of wars. And perhaps, in the moment they left America behind, they finally understood. Sometimes, freedom is not about crossing the fence, but about opening the gate within one's own heart. In the years after the war, America returned to a peaceful rhythm. Prisoner of war camps were dismantled, barbed wire fences removed, and barracks turned into farms, parks, or neighborhoods. The physical traces of captivity slowly vanished, but for those who had once walked through those gates, one thing remained indelible: kindness in the midst of chaos. For many former German POWs, America was not merely the land of the enemy. It was the first place where they were treated as human beings, even in defeat. The repatriation ships had long departed, yet the seeds of humanity planted by the Americans continued to grow in their hearts. When they returned home, many carried with them new values: freedom, democracy, and faith in the power of law over violence. They became a unique generation in post-war Germany, the so-called Amerika Deutsche, or Germans of the American camps. In a divided, devastated, and distrustful nation, they understood better than anyone that rebirth could only begin when people learned to respect one another. In West Germany, rebuilt under American guidance, many former POWs joined the new government, schools, and research institutes. Some recalled that in the democracy classes held in POW camps, they first heard about the U.S. Constitution, freedom of the press and elections, and the separation of powers, ideas once condemned as degenerate under the old regime. When the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, those seeds had already grown into a new political culture. As one German historian later wrote, German democracy was not born from the ruins of Hitler, but from the POW camps across the Atlantic. That legacy lived not only at the national level, but also in countless small stories. In a small Bavarian village, people still tell of Hans Kramer, once a POW in Texas, who opened a small workshop after returning home. On the wall hung a photo of him with a young American guard. When asked about it, he smiled. "That man once guarded me. He taught me how to fix a Ford engine and how to be kind." A simple story, yet it reveals a deep truth. Sometimes kindness is a more enduring form of education than any philosophy. Many Germans kept in touch with the American families who had helped them. Letters and Christmas cards crossed the ocean each year, clumsy English, awkward German, forming a fragile bridge between former enemies. Some reunions took place decades later, when hair had turned gray. They embraced without words, for none were needed. A handshake, a smile, enough to prove that war may create enemies, but humanity can make them friends. From those experiences, many former POWs became ardent advocates for international reconciliation. One of them, Dr. Wilhelm Lüttgert, once imprisoned at Camp Clinton, later became a diplomat and helped negotiate the 1954 U.S.-German Cooperation Treaty. In a speech in Washington, he said, "We were once prisoners of America, but there we learned the meaning of freedom." America won not only because of the atomic bomb, but because of its humanity. His words have since been quoted in countless histories, a testament to the power of compassion. Across the ocean, many Americans also remembered the German POWs they once guarded. For them, those years were not just duty, but a profoundly human experience. "I realized they were no different from us," one guard wrote in his memoir. "They missed home, feared death, and wanted to live. When the war ended, I understood. What divided us wasn't our nature, but propaganda. Many such men became informal ambassadors for reconciliation, supporting the Marshall Plan and educational exchanges between Germany and the U.S. As U.S.-German relations grew closer during the Cold War, the memory of those humane camps was often cited as the foundation of mutual trust. American historian Arnold Kramer once wrote, "If World War II left behind any positive legacy, it was in how Americans treated their enemies. They proved that humanity does not weaken a nation, it makes it stronger." It is ironic that within prison fences, places of iron and control, one of the finest examples of soft power was born. Americans did not reform prisoners through threats or propaganda, but by example, a fair meal, a borrowed book, a respectful greeting. That power was invisible, yet it lasted longer than any speech or victory parade. Years later, filmmakers, historians, and journalists revisiting the story discovered that the memory of German POW camps in America was not one of darkness, but of quiet transformation. In the 1989 documentary, The Good War and Those Who Refused to Fight It, a former German prisoner stands in an Iowa field and says, voice trembling, "Here I learned that the strong man is not the one who forces obedience, but the one who inspires trust." On a broader scale, that legacy continued through generations. The children of former POWs and guards became friends, colleagues, and partners. Student exchange programs between Germany and the U.S., launched in the 1950s, reminded a new generation that peace is not a gift. It is an achievement born of understanding. Cities that once hosted POW camps erected memorials, not to celebrate victory, but to honor humanity shown amid war. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, one of the largest camps, a memorial garden was planted where the barracks once stood. Each tree bore the name of a former prisoner who had studied there. In spring, the blossoms turned white beneath the sun, a living symbol of renewal. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a delegation of former POWs returned. They laid wreaths and bowed their heads, not in shame, but in gratitude. One said through tears, "We were treated as human beings, and that made us want to become better humans." Even in the 21st century, that memory endures. Many universities in both countries include the POW story and history curricula as a lesson in wartime humanity. In human rights courses, the American POW camps are not studied as military sites, but as laboratories of compassion. And as the last witnesses pass away, their stories remain. Not as museum relics, but as a moral inheritance. How we treat the different, the defeated, and the powerless. In today's world, where borders, conflicts, and hatred still divide nations, the legacy of the German POW camps in America sends a timeless message. Humanity is never a sign of weakness. It is the measure of civilization. The barbed wire has long rusted away, but if one listens closely, one might still hear the faint echoes of those who once stood on opposite sides, the songs mingling with the Texas wind, the laughter in the night, and the quiet vow never to let war steal human dignity again. Because in the end, the greatest victory in any war is not defeating the enemy, but keeping one's own humanity intact.